So in this last part, I want to talk about one of my favorite drinks, coffee. Now, most college students are very familiar with coffee. Most academics rely on coffee. And like wine, coffee is a product that has experienced a revolution in how it's marketed for the more sophisticated drinker. Unlike wine, it has a very humble background. It was once the industrial drink that was about improving performance, and today it has become the Starbucks drink, which is about conspicuous consumption and knowing, or third wave coffee, which is about knowing the source and the process of your coffee making. Now, an old reading, but a great reading, discussing the rise of yuppie coffee is by William Roseberry from the 1990s. So I've posted the citation here. And one of the things that Roseberry talks about is how there is all of these new ways of branding or marketing coffee as some kind of sophisticated thing associated with different aromas and places, and this mystique around coffee that he says has happened with the rise of the yuppie movement. So here you have yuppies, which are the young urban professionals, a play on the hippie, because many of them were once in the hippie generation and then they got jobs. And he argues that coffee marketing represents flexible accumulation. And by flexible accumulation, what he means is that capitalists have taken a product and separated it from the forces that produce it, where such that you can sell Ethiopian style coffee, but it won't necessarily depend on actually being from Ethiopia. And so these ideas of styles and aromas is a strategy of divorcing production from consumption and allowing them to sort of flexibly change and change their product to new consumer demands and interests. To use a kind of Marxist term, you have the fetishism of coffee. We don't know the method of production. Styles and flavors evoke the idea of production without explaining it. This idea, we think that it comes from these areas, but it doesn't. The label doesn't tell us anything more about this. And this turn, according to Roseberry, started in the 1975s as a response to coffee sales dropping. Increased focus on quality became a strategy to move away from quantity and focus on quality and a higher margin of profit. So, in this sense, coffee and taste for coffee starts to link to class. So there are different strategies they use. There are types of beans: Colombian, Arabica, Robusta, different origins: Guatemalan, Kona, Ethiopian, and also a multitude of processing methods, shapes, size, and textures of the beans. And the question mark here are, what are styles? In the sense, styles, when you hear Kona style, it evokes the Kona from Hawaii, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be from Hawaii. It's the traditional coffee that was once grown there has now been simulated in a kind of style and blend. Same with Blue Mountain style, drawing on or parasitism of the Blue Mountain branding, regional branding, without relying on that source. The other thing, flavors, adds to this idea, much like Coca-Cola with Coca-Cola Light or Sprite as being a kind of different type of flavor. The flavor industry has meant that you can start diversifying products using ingredients that don't have any place behind them. So the strategy of focusing on quality fits with a broader marketing strategy of segmented markets. You create diverse product lines, and some products get up-marketed to focus on a kind of more sophisticated consumer, a more educated consumer. Others get down-marketed, focused on price. This is cheap or convenient to use. Now, the revolution on the consumer side, on the demand side, was Starbucks. And Starbucks had a very interesting strategy in its early days. They would open up multiple chain stores near each other, because what they found was that even though those stores near each other competed, it had a kind of marketing, advertising and promotional effect. If people saw two Starbucks stores in the same neighborhood, they had the idea that they would need Starbucks. So overall sales in the neighborhood increased, even if within one store they were competing with each other. And this was called self-cannibalization. It was a branding strategy. The perception that Starbucks is everywhere forms a central part to why people associate Starbucks with quality coffee. And this was a revolution in coffee supply because Starbucks suddenly started appearing in areas that before didn't have a middle class or upscale type of coffee option. Now, obviously, in the areas such as my hometown of Austin, Texas, where there was, it became a threat. People complained that this was McDonaldization, that Starbucks coffee was displacing the local coffee shop. But others argued that it reached in areas that previous people couldn't get a hold of this kind of quality coffee. And so it was a sort of democratization. Now, you'll recall when we were talking early in the class on ethics and being an ethical eater, one of the things I'm interested in is this question about what products are we willing to be ethical with and which products do we not tend to think of in an ethical way. And coffee, interestingly, is a product where people are willing to pay for things like shade-grown, organic, fair trade. People will pay extra money for a coffee cup if they know that it has been made in an ethical way. This is because it's tied up with the marketing strategy of conspicuous consumption and high status. So if it's natural, fresh, and whole, these kinds of things add cachet, and this has also fueled some of the grassroots interest in self-roasting and local roasting, and also people developing a kind of artisanal interest in making coffee at home in a particular way. The other thing I've observed as I've lived in different places is that different countries have different traditions about how coffee is typically drank. So for example, here in Korea, coffee first entered Korea through the US Army in the form of instant coffee. And American soldiers were drinking instant coffee, and Koreans got interested in this. And so the Korean importers of coffee often brought in the best coffee and made instant coffee, the most famous being Maxim. And so these sachets of coffee where you pour it into a cup, add hot water, became really popular. And until the 1980s, this was what people thought of in Korea when they thought of coffee. A similar kind of revolution has been happening in Europe that's now spreading to the United States with these capsules. So the Nespresso capsule revolution. And these have significant consequences for supply chains, because the capsules, for example, have been criticized for being very ecologically inefficient. They're also not necessarily, they standardize taste, but they don't allow for much flexibility. And yet, as a marketing strategy, it's clear that part of it is based on this idea that you have this wide array of flavors in different capsules you can experiment with. So here you can see a map that just focuses on instant coffee versus fresh coffee as a preference, fresh being sort of drip or espresso. And I just highlight it to make the point. When I arrived to Korea, I thought this is really unusual that they use instant coffee, but in fact, in a large proportion of the world, instant coffee is considered the normal default option. Particularly here in East Asia, if you stay at a hotel, they'll provide you instant coffee as their beverage service. The other thing you'll notice is that even within a country, different types of classes of people have different tastes in coffee. And so coffee has become a status item, a way of differentiating yourself from someone else. So in Korea, for example, when I first arrived, everyone I saw was either having Americano, which is the hot water added to espresso, which I personally don't like. And Koreans will love this. And apparently this is a recent fad, and this is now, if you go to a coffee shop, this is the default coffee. Obviously, an older generation was continuing to drink the coffee mix, which is the instant coffee bag. But then if you meet people who really love coffee, there's a huge movement in Korea of coffee connoisseurs who have Dutch coffee. And Dutch coffee comes from the Japanese influence, and these people will make cold drip coffee at home. It'll take days to prepare. And so if someone tells me which of these three they drink, I can quickly sort of gather how these might reflect more broader cultural philosophies of theirs. The other reading by Mary White is a great book looking at coffee culture in Japan. And the first thing one thinks when they look at the title of this book is Japan has coffee, because in the West we tend to think of East Asian countries as being tea cultures. I can tell you that in Korea, more people drink coffee than tea. Coffee is a big deal now, but this is a new thing. In Japan, this is quite old, that there's been a century-long interest in coffee that White looks at. In her book, and in the chapter I'm recommending, she focuses about why it is the coffee shop has become a space that the Japanese particularly depend on and love. And it's not just about their love of coffee. And this is the other interesting thing about the rise of Starbucks and the rise of coffee shops, is the long history of coffee shops as this third space. Now, third space is this theoretical concept about a public space and a private space, or a domestic space and a workspace. The third space is something in between. The third space could be the place one goes between work and home, or the third place can be somewhere someone goes that is not a governmental or open public space, or a private use space, but something open to the public but run in a private area. And theorists are interested in third spaces because these are often serve a very important public function. They're a place where people can meet. And White argues that coffee shops are a really interesting space for the Japanese because they defy a lot of traditional problems in Japan. They're non-hierarchical. So while the Japanese workplace is very hierarchical, in a coffee shop, people can mix. It doesn't matter what your class or identity is. And this is true in the United States as well. They're anonymous places. You can go there. It doesn't matter who you are. You can be whoever you want, and you can choose whether you want to identify yourself in your status, or you can simply be there to read a book. And last, they're non-defined functions. This means that you can go in and study. You can go in and talk with other people. It doesn't direct you like a restaurant would that you have to eat here. And so she talks about how in Japan, they were often called the penny university, a place where intellectuals would go talk with each other, and you could learn all kinds of things. Now, again, I am an avid coffee lover, and so when I taught at the University of Vienna, I took advantage of my stay there to get to explore the many coffee shops in Vienna, which are in many ways the start of coffee culture in the world. And in the Viennese coffee house tradition, you can really see how, particularly in the 19th century and early 20th century, it became this important space for the bourgeois. It was a public sphere because this was a place where one could be seen and be conspicuous about their new status, but it was also a public space because it was where intellectuals could come, and it was free from the interfering government interest, but also public in that people could meet with others outside of their home. That's why you have famous artists, scientists, and politicians of this period who participated in these places, such as Sigmund Freud, Gustav Mahler, and Gustav Klimt. So one association with coffee shops has been that they are counterculture and also miniature democracies. And this can be a problematic thing because they are still private businesses and they face certain political realities. A year ago, Starbucks ran a Race Together coffee cup campaign where it tried to encourage its employees to engage with the clients, engage with the customer on issues of race. And this raised questions about whether these employees were suitably politically trained to do this, and whether Starbucks is the place where these kinds of risky political debates should be happening. So even though it has a kind of public sphere, it also has this private context about whether you want someone who's selling you something to be interfering with your personal private values. So all of this for me comes together in some questions that I think are interesting to discuss. One question is, do coffee and wine customers need to be educated about good taste? Is taste something that should be intuitive? Is taste something that should be personal and individual? Or conversely, do customers actually seek out and want or need to be re-educated about what a good coffee is? Should the coffee shop be telling the customer you can't have an Americano because Americano doesn't celebrate the coffee bean, you should try an espresso or cold drip? Or should that be something where they say the customer's always right? Similarly, what is the difference between education and marketing? Right? we think of marketing and advertising as something that is a corporate interested project, but there's a blurring in these campaigns about whether training you to be a better wine taster is about you being a smarter, more educated taster, or whether it's about promoting your interest in wine. And then finally, how does marketing play with and even construct these class identities and their linkages to taste? What does it mean to say you're a Coca-Cola drinker or you're a red wine drinker? And how does marketing shape that and the politics surrounding that?